to start, I want to really focus on the national first, because this is becoming a point of debate for many folks on the national political scene, with some statements recently by President Trump about kind of, asking Republicans to nationalize elections, if you will. First, can you kind of bring us up to speed on what's going on there for any of our listeners who aren't fully caught up? Just tell us what's going on, and then we'll get into whether or not it's good.
Yeah, so if you haven't been kind of following these issues, which I imagine a lot of people aren't right now, elections may not be top of mind for many people outside of wonky people, and which I count myself, right? So that's a self-identifying term there. But the federal government's been very active recently, particularly the Trump administration. So just in the last week or two, there has been a call from President Trump to consider, the term he used was nationalized voting in around 15 states. There's been an FBI raid on the elections office in Georgia, in Atlanta, kind of still continuing, even though it's 2026, we're still kind of looking into the 2020 election. And that follows on what happened last year with President Trump announcing, an executive order he wanted to do to end vote by mail, and the Department of Justice was probably continuing asking states for their voter rolls to try to create a central voter database in the Department of Justice. So there has been just a lot of federal activity in this space in a way that we typically have not seen, and there's a reason we haven't seen that. It's because when you look at the Constitution, it's very clear that states are the lead actors in the election space. There's a few exceptions, and that are explicit in the Constitution, but it says the states shall govern the elections. The time, place, and manner is kind of the language it uses of elections, and then Congress can also pass laws there. Now, one thing you don't see in any of what I just said and in the language of the Constitution is actions from the president, standalone, by himself or herself, unilateral. And that is a lot of what's been happening. Now, there is a piece of legislation I suppose we'll get into called the MEGA Act that's just barely been announced. So Congress is maybe announcing an intent to discuss some of these things. But as far as actions from the federal government, it's always been the president for the last year, certainly. And so that raises lots of questions when the Constitution says states, are the ones at the forefront of this, and Congress can do some things, but when all the activity is going on at the presidential level, it kind of raises the question: what are we doing? If the Constitution gives us this framework of states and Congress, then why is the federal government trying to do so much in the form of the president announcing actions, taking actions, and why is the president doing anything at all? Again, given that constitutional framework. And so that's when we get into these issues of federalism and what's the right line to draw for where the state's role ends and the federal role begins, or really more likely where the overlap is and where it's more distinct and not overlapping. And that's kind of what we're dealing with right now.
Derek, I want to read an excerpt from an ABC News article that we'll link to in the show notes. But ABC News reports that President Trump recently said this: the Republicans should say, we want to take over. We should take over the voting in at least many 15 places. The Republicans ought to nationalize the voting. We have states that are so crooked and they're counting votes. Again, that's a quote from President Trump. I think we'll include the link to the ABC News article. Reading something like that, saying that his party, the party that's in power right now, using language like taking over and nationalizing voting, obviously that's prompting some consternation from a lot of folks out there. Can you help put it into context? Is that essentially kind of what the administration is trying to do through some of these other actions, essentially saying, hey, let's centralize voting policy, voting power over election policy in Washington, D.C., or is that not quite the read of what he's saying or trying to do?
Well, I think the first thing when you hear something like that is there anybody who really believes that when the federal government takes over something, it gets better? I don't know that's got a great track record behind it. And so that's, I think, the first thing that comes to my mind. But then directly to your question, it does appear to be that way. I mean, we can't get into the minds necessarily of federal officials and the administration, what their intent is. But certainly their activity has been to the Department of Justice come in trying to beef up federal role in enforcement of election laws, for instance, around voter roll maintenance. Like President Trump recently said, the quote that you mentioned, trying to say we should just simply take over how votes are counted, take over these elections in these 15 states. There has been actions that would put the federal government ahead of the states in doing the basics of election administration. And that's just not been how we've run elections for the last 250 years is the thing. Again, it's kind of obvious when you look at what the Constitution says, but typically our elections are, votes are counted by local officials. That's where you go and cast your ballot. That's who gathers your ballot, tabulates it. The states tend to oversee that process, making sure things are being done above board, making sure that laws are being followed, maybe having some role in making sure that, things are being audited, machines are being audited to make sure they work properly, vote counts are being audited to make sure that they were counted accurately. So just kind of the oversight of the whole process. And then the federal government has typically set standards for things, standards on what kinds of machines are secure or those kinds of rules. And what we're seeing more recently is the administration and President Trump trying to say we need to be doing more of this stuff that the states and the localities have typically done. And here's where that's a concern. If you are someone, it all boils down to election security and election integrity. If you are someone who wants to commit election fraud, get your candidate or set of candidates to win regardless of how the vote goes, well, if you're faced with one of two scenarios, one, I have to somehow get into the local government where they're actually counting the votes, get into the state government where they're overseeing those things so they don't catch my fraud at the local level, and then I might need to even get into the federal level to make sure the rules that they're setting, standard setting are such that I can get into the local and state levels and commit that crime. That's one option. And the other option is everything's being done at the federal government level. Oh, great. I can go and just hack the Department of Justice database. I can go and manipulate the rules, pay off who I need to pay off, and try to corrupt the system that way with just one kind of line of attack. Which would you choose? It's much more complicated, expensive, and frankly impractical, if not impossible, to execute voter fraud on a wide-scale basis when the authority is spread across local, state, and federal governments. It's just really challenging and difficult to get that many people. You probably have to get hundreds of people across multiple levels of government all saying, yeah, I'm in on this, and we're not going to let it see the light of day. And that doesn't happen. That's why we don't have mass voter fraud in this country. Compared to, again, one centralized system that has shown itself to be hackable, that has shown itself to be influenceable by foreign countries at times. Again, just thinking espionage efforts and things like that. I mean, all you got to do is look up different spy podcasts, right, of the following CIA and FBI. Those things exist. They're not conspiracy theories. They're documented instances. And to put everything in that basket is, I think, an election fraudster's dream. And so it's concerning from election integrity standpoint that there's efforts to try to centralize things in the name of actually election integrity. It kind of raises the question, do we really understand how election integrity works? And probably not, because I don't think many people really think about it at that level, right? They just think about it at the level of, hey, I want to go cast my ballot, I want to have a good experience, I don't have to wait in a line for 6 hours, or whatever, the inconvenience might be. That when you know how you want to vote, you want to just be able to go vote. And that's how the way people think. And our Constitution is beautiful in that regard, in that it thinks about all these things for us. It says, and it's not to say we don't have to think about it, it's made the decisions already to say we have a multi-layered, complex system that is very difficult to penetrate, especially in the world that we live in, where everything is done in ways that can be checked by technology. Ballots are gathered by hand, they're run through machines by hand, they're checked and audited by hand. We're not relying on technology to count our votes, but we do use technologies to then say, okay, we're going to audit these results and see how they did. Did they show up accurately and correctly? And in a world like that, where you have kind of human administered elections being checked using technology also run by human beings, right? That's not being just outsourced to some AI overlord or something like that. It's a really secure system. And oftentimes people who don't think that's true will put forward evidence, that creates the possibility or potential of fraud without actually creating fraud. Things like, you hear a story, well, my daughter will move to college and I'm still getting her ballot and getting it in the mail every election cycle. She hasn't lived here for 3-4 years, something. And then when someone offers, oh, well, let's change that, they say, oh, no, she still wants to vote here. So things like that, that's not actually evidence of fraud. And if there was a possibility of fraud, the person reporting it is evidence that they caught it. And that's usually what most anecdotal stories and examples that are held forward as creating a possibility of fraud is actually an instance of fraud being caught by our multi-layered complex system where even an individual voter can help secure the integrity of our elections simply by doing common sense things.
Derek, there's something you're alluding to that I want to dive into, and it's essentially this, as I understand it, this very basic principle that number one, if you care about election security, you should be really worried about centralizing election policy and procedures at the federal level. And number two, I'm thinking, I consider myself, generally speaking, a political conservative, and it seems like federalism, yes, it's a core American principle, a constitutional principle, but in many ways I saw that's kind of a core principle of conservatism. Of we don't want things centralized at the federal level. We want things pushed out to the states more. And I guess the question I want to pose to you is, if I'm talking to someone who is maybe supportive of this, who someone says, yeah, we should be doing these things at the federal level, typically what I would then say, okay, let's say you do this. Let's say you centralize a lot of voting and election policy, procedures, whatever it is, at the federal level in Washington, D.C. Now imagine a Biden administration or a Harris administration, thinking of the last election, or in the future, let's say it's a Newsom administration or someone else. So if I'm speaking to folks on the Republican side who are maybe supporting this kind of thing, would you want an administration that's on the other side of you politically now sort of running all that centralized at the federal level? And it seems like that should be a pretty straightforward litmus test to understand where someone's limiting principle is in terms of federalism, that if you don't want the party you don't like to have this much power over something so essential as voting, then the answer is nobody should have that level of power, not only your side should have it. Is that a fair read of it?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, it's unfortunately I read that we far too infrequently take, in the political incentives that we often face, that elected officials often face, those trying to get people elected often face. It's just short-term get a win so you can go campaign, raise money, and get votes. And so, it's very short-sighted oftentimes, and those questions and conversations do happen about, well, what happens when the other side wins? And for instance, you see that, in the debate around the filibuster. And yet, that hasn't stopped us from continuing to erode things like the filibuster. So it's evidence that while that is a fair characterization, it's also one that maybe isn't being taken as seriously as it should. Because, the litmus test of whether something is good or not, probably in our system ought to be, is it good enough that you trust the other side to use it or not? And if it is, then you should go after it. And if it's not, then you're sowing the seeds of your own your own defeat, your own opposition, your own setbacks. So it's really, and these principles of federalism are grounded in conservatism. It is a foundation of conservatism, but it's really a foundation of America. That's how we do things, and the question becomes why. Because you say federalism, people's eyes start to glaze over, and what are we even talking about? We're just talking about the federal government or whatever it is. But what we're talking about is how we do government in a way that we can trust and hold accountable. In a federalist system, the biggest decisions are being made by the government that is closest to you, that local government, and then maybe the state, and then the federal level after that. And the more local something is, the more you can know it you can know the people involved in it, the more influence you can have in it, because if you know the people, you can go talk to them. If you know the process that's happening in your city, you can just go attend a meeting one night. If you know the issues being debated and how they're playing out in your community, you can go actually contribute meaningfully to the discussions and decisions being made. And the further you get away from that in terms of the person or the people making the decisions, the less influenceable, accountable to you, and trustworthy that is. Even if there's decisions being made that you like, there are going to be decisions you made that are made that you don't like. And when you have no ability to influence or change or hold accountable the people, the processes making those decisions that you don't like, that's inherently untrustworthy. And in a system that's supposed to be representative government, right? It's supposed to represent you as a voter, you as a member of the people. And doesn't mean you're always going to get what you want, but it does mean that you should have some say in what happens. And the more centralized things become far away geographically, the less that is happening, that representation is happening, and again, the more inherently untrustworthy and it becomes, and the more confidence is lost in that process. And when that happens at something so foundational to our free system of government as elections, that's the stuff of revolution. If you can't even believe anymore, I'm not saying this is not where we're at, right? I want to be clear here. It's not sky is falling, but although some people believe that, but I don't believe that. But if we ever get to the point where you can't even have sufficient influence over the person you're choosing to make the decisions on your behalf, that's exactly why the colonies revolted against the British Empire, because no taxation without representation. Those kinds of issues are fundamental to what we are as a nation. And so the real concern becomes when these things are being meddled with in ways that appear to be driven more by partisan interests, more by political interests, and more possibly even by personal gain than by the way the ideas of our Constitution, the way our nation is designed to function, the well-being of the people, the common good, just how our nation is supposed to function to bring about the pursuit of happiness and the well-being of our country.
Derek, we need to take a quick break. Can I ask you really briefly before we go to break? You mentioned the MEGA Act, and for our listeners, it's MEGA, not MAGA Act, which sometimes just listening we need to make clear. So the MEGA Act, what is it proposing? Good idea, bad idea?
Well, it is a play on MAGA, right? The Make Elections Great Again Act. So, you'd be forgiven for confusing the two. But it intends to move us towards, if I summed it up myself, it moves us towards a voting in person on election day, or as close to that as we can realistically get. So there's a lot of things around that that are around election security, for instance, requiring photo identification to vote. But then there's things like ban universal vote by mail, so that you can't just mail out a ballot to everybody who's a registered voter anymore. Ban things like ranked choice voting or ballot harvesting, that practice where instead of each individual taking their ballot to a drop box or an election center, there's people who go collect ballots and go turn them in. That's called ballot harvesting. Again, it's really centered on this concept that these ways of voting, mailing your ballot in, getting your ballot in the mail, having time to consider, the candidates, because you get the ballot mail early enough to be able to then think through, okay, who do I want to vote for, and things like that, rather than just going to the ballot box and finding out for the first time some of the names you're having to make a choice on. It's purportedly about election security, but again, it's doing that in a way that undermines election integrity by centralizing all the decisions in Washington, D.C. And rather than letting states and localities address their election systems to the realities they face, to the situations their voters are dealing with. For just to put out one example, universal vote by mail is actually really good in a big western state that has lots of rural area, because that way people don't have to drive hundreds of miles just to drop a ballot off somewhere. They can actually get their ballot in the mail, take the time they want to vote, go drop it in the mailbox, and know that they cast their ballot. And you can track that. It's not that it's insecure. In Utah, for instance, you can sign up, and I think it's now becoming the default option that you get a notification when your ballot is received by the post office, when your ballot is received by the voting center, when it's been processed. So it's not this drop it in the mailbox and hope it actually gets where it's supposed to go. You can verify that it's getting where it's supposed to go. And so the fact that it's centralizing these decisions, the fact that it's making these decisions on behalf of the whole nation in ways that don't make sense for a lot of the nation, again, coming back to that inherently untrustworthy thing, it's a one solution fits none kind of situation, possibly creating as many problems as it purports to solve. It really is probably coming from a well-intended place, but a poorly thought out place.
Thanks for watching that clip of Defending Ideas. For the full conversation, click the link in the description and make sure to like and subscribe wherever you get your shows.